Can people hear me now?
No, you won't need it. Because plus they streaming.
Yeah, we have a stream.
Okay. All right.
So y'all know what's it's 7 to.
I guess until y'all want to end. What is it, 7 or 8?
Yeah, that's what what
Really? I think about 8. Right.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so
So how do we begin?
I'll start and then.
Okay.
You ready?
Oh yeah, I'm ready, man.
Straight.
Do you want me to say anything?
you want
for
to
the
tell
people?
me just for
All
this?
right.
You see what Kevin will start, so I know you got to
Yeah. Peace and blessings, everybody. Welcome to 𝙬𝙘𝙖𝙧 Video Books Cafe. We are going to have an incredible conversation with the incomparable Dr. Carr. Give it up for my brother right here. Make some noise for the beautiful people in the crowd. All right. And we have an esteemed author here who's going to give us the real and the unfiltered and the truth about his perspective with some very interesting topics. I'm going to keep the suspense alive for you all. I want to thank you all for coming into 𝙬𝙘𝙖𝙧 physically and coming into 𝙬𝙘𝙖𝙧 through the digital realm in this futuristic time that we are in. So I'm humbled and honored to have you all here. And without further ado, I'm going to give it to Dr. Carr, who's going to take us to the future.
Thank you, Bob. All right. It's good to see everybody. It's good to see everybody streaming, and for those who will be watching after this live event on the recording, spread the word. 𝙬𝙘𝙖𝙧.com. This is the place where we gather to have these conversations. Before I ask the man of the moment, Professor 𝘬𝙘𝙖𝙧, to begin to talk, I want to just say that, of course, we are here to talk about your remixing of sorts and recombination, reintroduction for many, and introduction for many more of the work of 𝙂𝙗 Cabral and Return to Source. I'm sure you remember, I'm just old enough to remember when you couldn't get these books as easily. Revolution in Guinea or Return to the Source. You've made some combinations in this book and bringing to a new generation the work of 𝙂𝙗 Cabral. Just want to say that of all of the thinkers that we normally think about in that kind of group, Fanon, Cabral, unfortunately not as many women, although there are some. 𝙂𝙗 Cabral seems in some ways to be, and maybe I'm showing my own bias, the most accessible in some way. I'm very glad that you had that next to last chapter in there where he came over here and had that conversation in New York with members of the African diaspora in the United States. So everybody, tonight, we are very fortunate to have Professor 𝙬𝙘𝙖𝙧, who is a professor at Morgan State University. As I was mentioning to him, and thank you, his wife and son, for coming out tonight. Good to see you all. Everybody virtually. The whole family is here in case anybody get out of hand, so they can get them together. But I was mentioning that when I was in grad school at Temple in the African American Studies program, it was the only place in the country to get a PhD in African American Studies at the time. We were clamoring for a deeper understanding of African philosophy as such, thinking beyond the diaspora, and really this whole question of return to source I know you're going to talk about. And when you published the Hermeneutics of African Philosophy, I can remember that very distinctly because it was something we, many of us, have been looking for. So I want to, publicly thank you. And if you all are not familiar with the Hermeneutics of African Philosophy, please get Professor 𝙬𝙘𝙖𝙧's book, The Hermeneutics of African Philosophy, and also your anthology, major anthology, African Philosophy, The Essential Readings, among your other publications. So the next voice you'll hear will be Professor 𝙬𝙘𝙖𝙧, who will introduce the new edition of 𝙂𝙗 Cabral's writings, speeches entitled Return to the Source. And I hope by way of leading us into the discussion of the text, maybe give us some sense, because I've been watching some of the conversations you've been having as a result of the partnership with Monthly Review Press. And y'all can get it at 𝑠ankofa.com, by the way. It should be sold out here. How you even came to even do this work. Thank you, Professor Secretary. And let's have a round of applause as he begins to.
Okay, I am very happy to be here. Cabral is a very important and interesting person. And what I will do today, because I think things like this are better when we have a discussion. And so I will not monopolize the discourse. What I want to do is begin by setting up Cabral within the context of the contemporary discourse of African philosophy.
If I don't want you
Okay.
Yeah.
African. Okay, I'm sorry.
No. Professors, look, we be quick to forget them.
So I want to sort of set it up in terms of
Try this one.
I want to set it up in terms of the discussion in African philosophy, and then I want to line him up with two thinkers, Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. Okay, and set up, because see what's interesting is, Nyerere, Nkrumah, Agostinho Neto, the struggle in different parts of Africa, right? Much of this was sort of tinted with a bit of socialism and also with a bit of Marxism, Leninism, and things of that nature. And for example, if you look at a book like Nkrumah's Class Struggle in Africa, right? It's an attempt to adapt the idea of class struggle to the situation of the African revolution, okay, the African struggle against colonialism, right? So Nyerere has something to do with African socialism, but with Cabral, not only Cabral, to be sure, Cabral, Césaire, and Fanon, there's a way in which there is a break from this. What is this break? It begins with the idea that colonialism is basically the interruption of a history, okay? And that there isn't one homogeneous human history as such. There are histories. Histories are like personalities. My personality, your personality. The history, the culture of a people is its own making, right? So for Cabral, the point of departure for him is the idea that when colonialism came to our part of the world, it took us out of history. It did not insert us into history, right? Because there's a way in which, I don't like saying this, but it's true, there's a way in which, for example, Marxism, in a way, is amenable to the idea of colonialism and to the idea of the spreading of civilization, right? Because there are different stages, and Africa, unfortunately, was at an earlier stage, a retarded stage, right? And so, for example, Marx, supports the British in India. He says it's not a question of how vicious they've been or what bad things they've done. But if you think about it in terms of, the destiny of humanity, the history of humanity, then the English have a job to do in India, i.e. transpose civilization, right? Now, Cabral is completely against this, right? For Cabral, the struggle is to reclaim ourselves. Colonialism abstracts us from history, takes us out of history. And the act of engaging in the anti-colonial struggle is the act of re-entering history, right? So there are, at least in my reading, there are three fundamental notions in Cabral. One, return to the source. Secondly, re-Africanization. And thirdly, something he calls the frustration complex of the Westernized, right? And I want to begin with that because, we're speaking in America, in an African American place, and there's something very interesting about this that connects with Du Bois, right? Du Bois, for example, in Souls of Black Folk, talks about, if I'm not mistaken, two times mentions the idea of double consciousness. The first chapter, Spiritual Strivings, and the Hopes of the Fathers, chapter 10. The first chapter is basically saying, well, now, it's like we'd like to get rid of this double consciousness, right? This two-ness, right? Seeing yourself through the eyes of the other, right? Chapter 10, however, it's not quite that. He doesn't mention the term double consciousness, but he talks about the experience of this double consciousness. And what he says is, he says, and I'm quoting here, he says, it tempts the mind to pretense or to revolt, to hypocrisy or to radicalism, right? So this seeing yourself in both ways, right? The way the segregator sees you, right? And the way you see yourself, right? Of course, if you see yourself as a segregator, then you're done for. I mean, there's nothing more to speak about. But when you have this two-ness, he says, it leads to pretense or revolt, hypocrisy or radicalism, right? Now, Cabral has something like that, very similar, right? He says, in the colonial setup, right, you have the colonizers, the foreign occupiers, the Portuguese in this case, right? Then you have a large chunk of Africans who are assimilado. Assimilado is the Portuguese term for assimilated, right? And the closest thing to in the African American experience would be a black person who's trying to pass, right? So an assimilado, basically, or an évolué for the French also, because the French and the Portuguese are the two colonizers that wanted to make, black Frenchmen and black Portuguese, right? So the assimilado is the person who has gone beyond his ethnicity, passed beyond it, has properly become human, okay? In other words, he's left behind, right, the tradition. Now he says, so you have the assimilado and then you have the indigenous masses. Cabral refers to peasants. Maybe in this part of Africa, I don't have nomads, but you also have nomads, non-Westernized Africans. I say when I talk I tell you, the Africans that you see in National Geography, right? Africans that don't wear shirts like I, right? These are indigenous, non-Westernized Africans, right? And so he says, the assimilado finds himself caught between these two, see? And he finds himself caught between these two because on the one hand, you have the indigenous masses who are always in conflict. There's always conflict. They're always at a disadvantage because the European has the technological advantage of having mastery of nature, right? Well, indigenous people don't have it. They're always at a disadvantage, right? But they're always confronting the colonizer, right? On the other hand, you have the westernized assimilado, who as much as he wants to assimilate, right? As much as he wants to assimilate, is never completely accepted, right? He's always the assimilado, right? He's always the Negro, you understand? He's always not quite good enough, right? And so he's caught in between. And in this conflict, he says, in this conflict between the indigenous masses and the colonial power, the westernized African then suffers from what Cabral calls a frustration complex, right? What is this frustration complex? He can't quite become white. Do what he may, right? And on the other side, he always experiences the struggle of the indigenous. It is in this situation then that what the boys mentions comes in. It says, the mind is tempted between revolt, pretense or revolt, hypocrisy or radicalism, right? So the westernized African, right, in this situation is the one who commits class suicide, the petit bourgeoisie, right? The petit bourgeoisie, westernized African, joins the movement. When he joins the movement, then in one stroke, he does two things. One, he kills himself as a westernized, right? And in that process, comes into contact with the indigenous people and then relearns his history. Now, I want you to notice that this is something that Cabral encountered in his own experience, because Cabral graduates from high school and then ends up in Portugal to study agronomy, right? And ends up, and it takes him 5 years, he comes out as an agronomist. And the first job he had is working for the Portuguese Department of Agriculture, right? And so he's sent to the overseas provinces, right? The overseas provinces of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, right? And then, as he's working as an agronomist with them, he's also relearning his Africanness. So this concept of re-Africanization is something that he gets from his own lived experience, right? So he re-Africanizes like that. Okay, so re-Africanization then, see what's interesting is this, it's to reclaim our Africanness, right? And there's something, at least in my experience, very interesting similarity to the African American experience, because African American experience, for example, if the film Amistad is accurate, right? These people, enslaved Africans, come here, they're denied everything, right? They're denied everything. They come here and they succeed to reclaim their humanness, right? And how do they do that? They don't do it by going and living the way the African forefathers lived. They've lost that. They don't have that, right? But they come here and they create a literature, a cuisine, a language, a music, right? They recreate something which is not European and something which is not African. They recreate African American. What's his name? Amiri Baraka, in his book, The Blues People, for example, somebody says, when, and I won't be able to pronounce it, but he says, when somewhere, in some place, some black man or woman said, I'm so tired of this mess. Then he says, there you don't have Africans anymore, you have the African American. A language is created. You understand? And so this too is what Cabral is, this Africanization, re-Africanization, right? And he talks about it, along with that, the central concept is the idea of a return to the source, right? Now, what is the source that we return to? Again, I want you to notice it's not a question of, going back, living the way the Africans, it's not that. The idea is that the human being is a being that inherently there's something generic about it, generic human identity, as African philosopher Marcin Toa says, is what makes us human is that we create, we invent out of need, right? We're not species specific, right? In other words, any environment, the human being is capable of engaging it, of inventing, of creating a culture and a history out of confronting his or her needs, right? And so the return to the source is that. It's going back to our humanness, which was denied by enslavement or colonialism, right? So the colonized becomes a laboring thing, right? You see, the idea that you have a problem and you create a solution for it, right, becomes, just vanishes, right? In other words, you expect solutions from elsewhere, right? In other words, there's famine in Africa, and so then, there's supposed to have been a joke, the peasants in my country of origin, Eritrea, supposed to have said, is it raining in Canada? Is it raining in America? I say, yes, all that is okay. The stuff, in other words, and that's one of the reasons why that country won't take foreign aid like that, right? In other words, there's a way in which we create our humanity, right? And enslavement and colonialism, right? That is what it's a kind of castration. It's a kind of making some important. In fact, interesting enough, there is a book by West African writer 𝘼𝙢𝙞 𝙤𝙬 entitled Hala. Hala in Wolof means castrating, impotence, right? And what does he use that for? He's saying the westernized African is important. Why? Because it's a replica, right? What does that mean? If you look at Africa today, we're independent on the whole, but we're really not independent, right? Because Africa is nothing but a replica. This replicates what is done, in Europe, in America, right? Okay, so these are, the main concepts in Cabral, this idea of re-Africanization, return to the source, and the frustration complex out of which this re-Africanization, return to the source gets enacted. Now, I want you to notice that Cabral is interesting because he's very, he's true to the context in which he works, right? He's not interested in imitating anything or anybody. Not Fanon, not Césaire, okay? But in being like that, he also, so in a way, replicates something that you find in Fanon. Fanon, for example, in The Nature of the Earth, here he says on the second page, he says, the thing colonized, the thing colonized becomes human through the very process through which it liberates itself, right? Cabral, in his text, shows us what that means in the context of the African situation, right? Now, when Fanon says thing, right? If you go back and look at Césaire's book, Discourse on Colonialism, you find that he makes this blunt affirmation. He says, colonization equals thingification, right? The colonized is thingified, right? And this is 1955. And then in 1956, when he left the French Communist Party, when he leaves the French Communist Party, when he resigns from it in his letter to Torres, he talks about the fact that we as a people, meaning people of color, right? Meaning Africa and its diaspora, he says, have a right to our own singular situation, right? Now, when he comes up with this idea, interesting enough, somebody by the name of Jean-François Lyotard comes up with this idea that the narratives of modernity are passé, they're finished, right? Now, here I quote this in 1979. Césaire wrote his letter of resignation in 1956. So long before Lyotard, Césaire had already proclaimed the end of his narrative, this grand narrative of enlightenment, progress, civilization, right? And what is it that he's insisting on? That we have, that history is unique, specific to each people, right? And so he says we have the right to initiative, the right to personality. And by personality, what is personality to a person is culture and history to a people. And then he says, and what does that mean? It means that the universal that he talks about, humanity, the universal of particular, right? So the universal of Europe, the universal in which particularity is subsumed, right? And the most important thinker of this universality, somebody I'm working for, like Hegel, and for Hegel, universality is subsuming, right? Just like, amoeba engulfs its prey, right? Europe spreads out on the globe, takes it over, Europeanizes the world, and that then becomes universal. Césaire says, no, our universal is universal, a patchwork universal, is universal of particulars. And this universal of particulars then, furthermore, interesting enough, because this does not come from a Christian, is do unto others, right? You see in the other yourself. The other becomes something very, very important, right? And so it's a universal of particulars, right? In other words, so each particular, in defending my particularity, I acknowledge yours, right? As opposed to, negating you. That was the European, that was colonial. We have been universalized through that. Okay. So, I wanted to bring that up because, for me, Cabral is very much, in tune with Césaire, with Fanon, right? Because the revolution, the African revolution, there is not anymore thought of as some global. No, it's something peculiar to Africa, right? We have to reclaim ourselves, and we haven't done that thus far. Thus far, what has happened in Africa on the whole is we've been able to expel the foreigner, right? But the foreigner remains, right? In Halaz, in Osman Hassan Ben's book, Hala, the main character, I forget his name now, says, we have him inside us. He said, what inside us, right? You see? And so that is the struggle that still remains. Okay. I said I was going to say very little, but I said everything. If there are questions.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. In fact, we're going to, before we start thinking about what you want to ask, I want to just maybe toss a few things out. As you wrote in the introduction, you asked yourself the question that I suppose anyone might ask you, which is, what can we learn from Cabral today? And as you assembled this, I thought about something. I saw a book during COVID down. Highly was reading it, this new, well, I guess new translated into English, biography of Cabral by the 𝘼𝙢𝙞 brother, I think, Tomas. And going through the archive, going through new material, having interviewed a bunch of folks, he says that he suspects that Cabral may have, in the interest of really advancing this collective work, this revolutionary work, maybe glossed over some of the challenges, maybe over represented the state formation they were doing and getting at the time when they were reclaiming what almost 75% of the country from the Portuguese, the clinics and the educational. And he takes it all the way through his, of course, assassination, with the tensions between him, of course, being born in Cape Verde, but I'm sorry, born in Guinea, but his people from Cape Verde. And he says that tension runs all the way through. My question to you really, as it relates to class, which is so important for Cabral, as we know, coming from an African in the diaspora, such as myself, and I'm thinking about that chapter where, as you say, he's talking to the African people here in the United States, and he says, if I didn't have to fight my fight,
I'd stay here with you.
I think I would stay here with you all, right? But at the same time, he says, we're brothers and sisters, but it's, while that's good, we like each other, we must be comrades. What can we learn from Cabral when he himself, part of that, like you said, it's not a true bourgeoisie, right? Like a petty bourgeois, he got that education, he's come back. What can we learn from Cabral about our challenges, specific to wherever we find ourselves in the African world, to truly commit class suicide and not recreate this notion that somehow we should be the ones leading a revolution? And I know you must grapple with that as a professor, as a scholar, because you're in an institution that, like Howard or Morgan, anywhere else, is set up to replicate the class structure that we're trying to fight. So what can we learn from Cabral about having it?
See, what's interesting about Cabral, I don't know how to put it. Yeah, is that he's true to the context. I was thinking of this way, for example, if you look up the word theory, right? Theory comes from Greek and it means theoros, watching, looking, right? And so one time I think that theory meant just inventing. It's not quite that, right? It's like allowing yourself to be the vessel through which what shows itself. Understand? And so for Cabral, it's not, and he says, in his interview, he says, I'm not against Marx or Lenin, or I'm not claiming that, I'm nothing like that, but he says, for us, we have to do our situation here. We have, and he says, we don't have workers the way you have workers, or the way our towns and cities are different than the countryside is not quite like yours. We don't have hundreds of fields like that, right? It's different. So one has to be true to the context, the specific situation in which one finds oneself, right? I think that's the first thing that you have to learn from Cabral.
Yes, sir.
And secondly, also the idea of this, reclaiming. Interestingly enough, this idea of reclaiming the lost possibilities of human existence, right? For example, in the context of European philosophy, I don't know how, but it's there's a thinker by the name of Martin Heidegger who wrote the book Being and Time, right? And in one of the most important chapters of that book, he talks about this idea of retrieving the lost possibilities of Dasein. Now, Dasein for him is the human being, right? So now, what are the lost possibilities? Well, he's talking about modern society, technology, and for people who know the film Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin, right? Alienation, right? Technology taking over. And so, in making us, enabling us, technology simultaneously takes away from us certain capabilities, right? Denies. And so, what Heidegger is saying, not more to it, but what he's saying is, that this capacity to reclaim, right? That the critique of modern society is a critique aimed at the capacity to reclaim our lost possibilities, right? That will not just anonymous individuals, that we are capable of ourselves engaging in things, creating things, right? You know, and Cabral also, this is what he's saying. Cabral is saying there's a way in which we have to reclaim, right? And now I don't want to mention this. I'm mentioning this not because I want to talk about my country of origin, but the war in Eritrea was a war that was, you know, the Somalis helped us, the Sudanese helped us, the Arabs, for their own reasons, helped us, but the whole of Africa did not help us. So in Eritrea, when one went to battle, one had to calculate, right? What are we going to fight? We don't, you know. So they came up with slogans, you know, defeat the enemy with his own guns and bullets, right? And then they came, and then many times machines would be broken, tanks would be broken, and so then you have to have repair shops, right? You have to have repair shops. You have to repair these weapons, right? Sometimes they had a tank they called vodka cola, which was a tank which was a mixture of an American tank with a Russian tank transmission. Understand? Now, what is this? This is, you know, this is the generic human identity, the capacity to create out of humans, right? And also, by the way, it's nothing, I'm not telling you anything new, because this is the history of Africa. Right? I mean, I'm not advocating that we should eat chitlins, but to make food out of chitlins takes. So that's what I think. We can read from Cabral.
So I've got one more, and then please, Rod. This one, so like you said, the dialogue is so important. Being true to the context, you know, as you remind us, both through your comments and through his speeches directly in writings, you know, Cabral was a diplomat. He wasn't a militarist, as he said. I mean, he had to, you know, he wasn't militarily trained. The people out there, again, one of the perhaps sources of tension between Guinea, where the fight is going on, and in the islands, they're not fighting. In fact, that's where the bourgeoisie is coming from. What has changed between Cabral's time and ours in terms of context? And I'm thinking about this very specifically. I think this month, his party, well, if you can still call it his party, PAIGC, won with the coalition majority of seats in the parliament in the elections, I think this past June, well, about 2 weeks ago. And we know that Cape Verde is not Guinea, Bissau, that the two countries they broke up. And we also know that, as you were talking, I was thinking about this in terms of reclaiming the lost possibilities of human existence, the idea that they had a common enemy, because when they asked him, as you collect in one of the question and answer periods, it was England and New York, and they asked him, is the OAU a good thing? Are they with you? And Cabral is like, yeah, they're all with us. You know, some, you know, maybe more than others. Yeah, some of them. But today, we see, and even when asked, he doesn't take an opportunity to critique Mobutu or 𝘖𝙢𝙤. He says they're only doing what they can do. I mean, they're in this imperial thing. But
one person.
No, jump in.
One person, Kamuzu Banda.
Oh, Banda, for sure. He critiques Banda. Well, I'm thinking about that in this context, and those who may not be, when we talk about these African leaders who, as Portugal, who I loved it when he called Portugal basically a colony of England. He said, this weak Portugal really doesn't have colonies, but he's saying in here, and then NATO, he says, I'm not NATO is NATO, don't worry about that. But these Western powers take out these leaders. When presented by the diaspora, African was within Nkrumah as the father of Pan-Africanism, he says, nah, it was really Du Bois. He said, and I knew Nkrumah, I loved Nkrumah, I spoke at Nkrumah's memorial. Nkrumah said there's some things I would have been done different when they were in Conakry, was meeting and talking with him. What has changed between then and now? Then, when you have these colonial powers and there are clear lines, even as there are variations within the struggle, and now, when it seems, I don't want to say hopeless, But it seems like the conditions present themselves with a very much more complex. It's harder to see who the enemy is. There's a more developed bourgeoisie in Africa, in the diaspora. Our conditions, I don't want to say they're worse now. How conditions change between Cabral's time and now, as we think about the things that Cabral is making us have to think about in terms of we want to really transform society.
Oh, no. You next, well, I'm done. After that, yeah, that's what. You want? Go ahead.
It's kind of
Okay, you want to rep? Yeah, I can do that, and then you can, and then that way it may be the same spirit.
I mean, it's kind of in continuation to what I was saying, in the sense of like, it seems that people are taking on the perceptions of those imperialist, nationalistic boundaries more so now than during that time. You know, it's more solidified. And I guess that's kind of, there's not a place you can necessarily go to in a specific sense. So it's like, I kind of look at it just from what I've been researching. You look at Garnett, who was going to Africa and did those negotiations, and then you have Malcolm trying to do the consciousness of liberating mentally. So I guess it's how do you navigate the mental with these boundaries being more solidified?
See, what I would say is a way in which in the colonial times it was sort of black and white, right? It was open. Right? What has happened now is we have westernized Africans that rule the continent. Yes. The way, right? I don't like making propaganda for myself. In my book of 2015, Existence and Heritage, yes, I come up with this idea of replicant. Yeah, and I got that idea from Star Trek, if anybody remembers Star Trek, where you had these alien beings that would come into an area and they become like us.
The Borg.
No, not the Borg, but this is a replica. They replicate. They take on human form. They become black. They're here, and so they become black, and then go somewhere else, become something else.
More like the scrolls.
Now, in Africa, what you have is a replicant class, a replicant state, right? And you have to, it's in every little detail, right? For example, the way European armies march, Liberation Day, Independence Day, the way, right? All that is replicated, right? You see, I would say just one thing, and not getting more please. My country of origin, the first Liberation, Independence Day celebration was the truest, because those who marched were the handicapped fighters.
Yes.
It was not an imitation, understand? Whereas in Africa today, everything is an imitation. Something is not done because there is a need for it. No, that's how it's done in Paris. In Cote d'Ivoire, this character has replicated the Vatican.
Yeah.
Okay, you are a Catholic, but you really need St. Peter's Square. So we have to, that has to go. We have to. The character of the struggle has become more complex, very much more difficult, right? And also, the colonizers were crude and vicious. Neo-colonial rulers are even worse. I mean, just, anyways. So that's the problem. I don't have an answer.
So you think that's the biggest difference
That's
between
the-
then and now? They've taken root more now.
Yes.
Please, anybody? I think Baba Peter has his trick.
And also, this is here.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would like to get a response to a group, some of us, an organization that I belong to here in DC, we are talking, we're thinking about having calling a Pan-African, a Pan-African gathering. And the way we were thinking about doing it, at least from my perspective, and this is my position on this. I'm a Malcolmite. I believe that one of the mistakes that we make is we spend too much time trying to convince people. What we should do is get the true believers. If you believe in Pan-Africanism, we first come with what it is. We go through all the greats, the Cabral, Brother Cabral, and Brother Malcolm, and all these people, and get a definition of what Pan-Africanism is. Then we say, if you believe in Pan-Africanism, please come to this meeting. If you don't, stay home. This is not a meeting to teach. This is a meeting to talk about what we can do. This is not a meeting to teach and to discuss, the concept of Pan-African. This is a concrete meeting that people who believe in that and who then will come up with some concrete suggestions that we can do to promote Pan-Africanism. Because I think what we do too many times is that we are 20 people. We know 15 are, 5 are serious and 15 are kind of wavering. And instead of taking those 5 and doing something, we spend all our time trying to get to 15 and end up everything falling apart. So my thing is, I think we should take the concept of people like Brother Cabral and people who had a Pan-African position, take those concrete things, put them together, and say, now, if you believe in these things, come to this meeting. If you don't believe, stay home. This is a meeting for the true believers. And it's be solutions oriented.
What I'd like to say to that is, for example, in this book, Cabral talks about Pan-Africanism. I think it's in the last section when he's discussing with African Americans. And he says, Pan-Africanism, but it's complicated. In other words, what does it mean for Africa to unite? See, what we have to keep in mind is there never was one Africa. There wasn't an Africa. There was a continent. At one time, the northern part of it was the African province of the Roman Empire. Okay, now Africa has many cultures. And before the Europeans came and colonized Africa, by the way, the only place that was not colonized is what today is known as Ethiopia, which at the time was Abyssinia, which itself colonized the Somalis, the Oromos, the southwestern people, established itself like that. Except for that, everything else was colonized. But before it was colonized, it's not as if, it was one. No, you have Oromos in Ethiopia, you have Oromos in Kenya, for example, right? You have Ben Amr in Eritrea, you have Ben Amr in Sudan, right? Now, so they cut us all up, right? But not because we are all one, no, because you see what I'm saying? In other words, it was not as if it was one, what's that film that African American film?
Wakanda.
Wakanda. It's not like that. It's more complicated.
Right.
I understand.
Let me just add one more thing. I'm sorry. And so African unity has to be, I'm for it. But see, I'm from Eritrea originally. For 30 years, as the country was being blown away, the OAU was meeting in Addis, doing nothing about it. Okay. I'm not saying this to speak badly about my Ethiopian brothers or anything like that. But unity has to come as a result of people wanting to unite. It cannot be legislated. It cannot be, I know we're all Africans, hence you have to. No, it's not like that. Right now as we speak, for example, Morocco is trying to unite with the Sahrawi Republic, what used to be Spanish Sahara, right? Now these people want to be independent. And Morocco is saying, no, we're all Arab, we're all Africans, we're all Muslims, we still have to come. That kind of unity I'd much rather do without, because it is something that's forced on me, right? With the Sahrawi Republic, Morocco, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, they want to unite, good. But it has to be, and so right now, what I would say is we ought to first establish ourselves, create within each border African country states that are for the people, right? And then we can have, we can have unity. It cannot, this is what I'm saying. I'm trying to sort of replicate what Cabral says. That is what he said. He said, I am for unity, but we have to have unity whereby,
I understand, brother. All I'm saying is, then what to be called, we are calling a meeting for people who believe that Africa should be continental. If you believe that, please come to this meeting. And we're going to start talking about what else we can do to advance this. But we spend every time, when you spend all the time trying to, you get the true believers. And then you do something. We have, like I said before, we have 20 people, 5 or 2 believers, the other 15, and we take all our time talking to the 15 instead of taking the 5 and say, okay, here's some concrete things we're going to start doing. That's all I'm saying. Find the people who believe in Africa being continental, or find the people who believe in Pan-Africanism, and then get them together and start coming up with concrete things to do to advance this belief, rather than spending all our time trying to persuade and convince and all, because people generally follow. If they see people who believe in that do something concrete, they'll say, "Oh, that was nice. We may try to do that." But we can spend all our time, and I'm 85. I'm not doing it any longer. Anybody I have to convince about Pan-Africanism, I say, I'll talk to you later.
Yes, sir.
You don't believe in Pan-Africanism, then I have no time to talk to you. I want to talk only to the true believers.
Bob Peter, I'm thinking about this because coming from Tuskegee, and I'm thinking about it in the context of what you remind us of in Cabral's writings of a couple of things. Number one, the distinction between the rural and urban areas and what they did in Guinea by going beyond where the Portuguese could penetrate and providing people with services, providing people, most of the people couldn't read and 95% couldn't read. And I'm thinking about it also in the context of chapter 6, the speech he gave at Lincoln University, 1972, October 72, where he's talking about what do people want? When people want not only identity, but dignity. And think about that in the context about Peter, and this is no secret to you, of course, having grown up in what is relatively speaking the country. The culture of the people, the good parts of it, he wanted to keep. The parts that needed to be abandoned, he wanted to get rid of. He didn't want to completely get rid of everything Western. That's not possible. When you mentioned, maybe think of Ngugi in Something Torn and New, when he says, this is a new thing we're dealing with, this question of modernity. Even as he says, I started writing the Kuyu in part because you say that you created a new language in English and French. He said, no, that's the colonial language. You can't fix it. And then, of course, thinking about the Creole in Cape Verde, which is not the official language there now, but it's considered a language, but they also associate that, perhaps it would be fair to say, with the Portuguese or with the bourgeois. How important is it in trying to help people see unity? What Cabral says in that conversation with the African Americans, comradeship, political unity, as opposed to just saying we're brothers and sisters. How important is it to displace ourselves, displace that quote unquote talented tenth, that petty bourgeoisie, and say, I'm here, perhaps like Snick did in the 60s, to help, not to culturize you, not to teach you, but to listen so that we can collectively create some sense of identity, dignity, common purpose, maximizing our humanity. Is that what Cabral, partially anyway, is trying to get at when he's talking about class suicide? And might that provide some sense of how we might go collectively together without trying to tell people what they need?
When he talks about class suicide, it's the idea that these are westernized Africans, like who have privileges, who have education, who know the Western world, and so there's a way in which, if they're going to do anything, they have to commit suicide, meaning immerse themselves into the local milieu, the local environment, become re-Africanized, right? And so this class suicide is, in a way, at their expense. In other words, I then do not have the luxuries that I have now, right? Now, it's important that these luxuries are also that which is connected with the corruption and all that goes with it, you understand? And so, it's not something, I mean, Cabral advocated this, and many people engaged in it, but it's not something that can easily be done. In other words, there are chunks of Africa, for example. The idea of assimilado, for example, or evolve, somebody like Senghor, for example, right, claims that he has two countries, Africa and France, right? And then he talks about negritude, right? You see, that is a very, very strange kind of negritude, right? In other words, so there's a way in which it's this class suicide, this frustration complex that I was mentioning earlier. By the way, he talks about that also in that same piece, chapter 6.
Yes.
The way, how do we reclaim our Africans?
Yes.
And what's difficult about that is that, one, there are no models, right? Maybe one model, think about it, African American.
Say that again, that's very crisp. There are no models.
Yeah, except we can talk about African American as a model. People reclaim themselves. Understand what I'm saying? In other words, there's a way in which you have to imagine you find yourself in Alabama, Tennessee, or some godforsaken place, you by yourself, nobody speaks your language, you lose the language, right?
Yes.
And then something else is created, right?
Yes.
These people create something, right? And so we need to do that. In Africa, we haven't done that. In Africa, see, what's interesting is this. For example, the Igbo that was enslaved, 𝘼𝙢𝙞.
Yes.
𝘼𝙢𝙞,
Yes.
for example, is going away, he's being sold into slavery. He sees the whites in the ships there, and he's afraid they're going to eat him. And he said, I wish I had remained there as a slave in my own place. And then the African American, the ancestors that come here, remember Africa. They tears in their eyes, like a good place, you understand?
Yeah.
Never mind whether it was good or bad, but that's how that's the memory of Africa. The Western, whereas in Africa, the colonizer creates a two-tiered society, right? Two-tiered society whereby here you have Western society, right? And science becomes not presented as the ingenuity of the human beings, presented as something that rubs off from the whiteness of the white, you understand? Science becomes, something that comes from the whites. Then you have indigenous society, right? You have cleanliness, dirt, wealth, poverty. So the African, the Westernized African, grows up, distancing himself. Whereas the African American recalls the past. You understand what I'm saying? Africa is not remembered as a bad place. Whether it was or not makes no difference, right? But it's remembered as a good place. You understand what I'm saying?
Now, was that always the case in your experience, in your lived experience? Was the idea of Africa among African people here like it is today?
Well, I came to this country in 1971. I came as a refugee student, basically. I came here, and I came, and what do I come to? I came to Brother James Brown say, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud.
Black
Say it
out,
loud.
no
That was, of course, to get there, hair conking and all that had to be passed. I understand that, right?
Yes, yes.
But in Africa, it's different. In Africa, see, you have to understand it. The child is born there, right? The father and mother, whatever, one is a teacher, somebody has a little money, right? And so, whereas the indigenous tribe is barefoot. He lives in a little hut, has no shower, whereas I do, right? And so that is what is so Africa becomes that. The West is this betterment, right? So when he says class suicide, right? That's all that has to be suicided. All that is what has to be killed. We have to be able to go beyond that and reclaim our Africanness, right? Because Africa is reduced to a symbol of misery in colonialism, not before. You see, we have to be able to go to that. We have to reclaim that. By the way, for those of you who might be interested, I just in the book Being and Time, section 74, there's this idea of retrieve, lost possibilities, right? And he talks about it in terms of European culture, but you can always.
Thank you. No, it's okay. You got it back there, right? Who's got the microphone? Oh, you want to ask? And then, thank you.
So, I mean, you've been talking about it, but I just wanted to be clear. First, greetings, Professor. I'm sorry. I'm going to show my manners. What is Cabral's thinking on the importance of culture and its role in the struggle for liberation? You've been talking about it some, but really about culture itself. And I know one of the aspects is unity, but with there being so much influence from Western culture throughout the world, what are we actually recreating? Is it just another form of that with some sprinkles of Africa within it? Or are we really creating an African culture in and of itself in this reclaiming or returning to the source?
See, for Cabral, that is the way I read him. The way I read him. No, keep going. The way I read him, Cabral, see, there's nothing for Cabral or Sevilla or Fanon, there's nothing sacrosanct about African culture. Right? There's much in African culture that is, in my view, rather dirty, that we ought to get rid of. For example, female genital mutilation. Right? We should get rid of that. The idea that some people are superior, others inferior. The idea of slaves. The idea of ethnic animosity. Right? But there are also many other things. For example, it is not true that the Greeks originated democracy. Large parts of Africa were administered by the democracy of elders that sat under trees and did not vote but discussed, just consensual democracy. Okay, so the idea is that any and every aspect of Western culture, because it's also human culture, it's not the culture of alien or devil, it's human culture. So whatever is suitable, whatever we can appropriate, we ought to appropriate, right? Simultaneously, in African culture, right, we get rid of that which is unhelpful. For example, in a war of liberation, you need arms to carry guns, right? You cannot do that if you believe women are inferior. The very idea of it. So what do you have to? So the idea of women's liberation then becomes something central to the movement. And so, you see, so what happens is, it's also, by the way, it's Cabral and Fanon, but it's also, this is hermeneutics. In other words, the needs of the present become the sieve through which you sift what you keep and what you get rid of. Okay? And there's nothing else, in other words, just because my forefathers did it, right? There's nothing interesting. But then there are things that my forefathers did that is interesting, that I should be able to reclaim. By the way, that is what this place means, right? The name of this place, Sankofa, means retrieving, reclaiming what was lost, right? And so we need to do that, right? That we have to make, because above all else, in the past and the future, but above all else is life, lived life. And what matters is being able to sustain that, right? And so whatever helps to sustain that, you appropriate, you preserve. Whatever does not, you get rid of.
You made a statement about the Westerners bring the science. Is that correct? And what I've come to understand from my time in Europe is it's not science. It's white supremacy.
Okay.
And when we take it from an earlier standpoint of what schools do we have, that will create the culture, especially the early childhood. So before they're even aware of themselves, they've already been colonized in their minds at very early ages. So much so that they don't have to worry about when they get in their teens or their 20s or their 30s. It happens at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending upon what ages they start the process of colonization. And that is what they're more concerned about all across the world. Like we just had a conference with the ambassador of Tanzania on Saturday. And I asked them a couple of simple questions about what were they doing about the eugenic-induced society like they had in Rwanda, about the education of Tanzanian children. And some of the things, just by his answers, I could, pretty much see the similarities of what was going on in Tanzania and what's going on right here in Washington, D.C. Because the first thing he said was, we got 50% female in our country who are in Parliament, and we have a female president. We got a female mayor here in D.C. Mm-hmm. You can see the colonization of the mind, and there's no sense of what do we do with the African. It's like, no, we allow the Western part, because in our minds the Western part is superior. And it goes back to what you said earlier about this earlier concept of superior and inferior that was already there, and how they take advantage of it. So what is your thoughts about how Paul speaks to that, and then how he focused in a little bit of what Fanon was saying around, in the wretched of the earth, around, it's that prison of the mind. I think that's what Mr. Bailey was speaking to when it came to Malcolm. Malcolm was talking about free your mind, so regardless of where you are, regardless of where you are, your mind is free. And that allows you to recreate these societies where you take the best of and sort of leave the rest of it out. That sifting process that you were speaking of.
It's for example, in the books that everybody I hope knows, right? Things fall apart, right? The Africans get defeated when they allow the missionaries to build in the evil forest. You can see the evil forest was the limit of the science of the African. And what's interesting is that, Judeo-Christian tradition, right? The Judeo-Christian part is the book in religion, right? It's the Greek. The Greeks are the source, and they, of course, are connected also with ancient Egypt. But it is from them that this culture of seeing, of learning, of the disclosure of what shows itself, nature, right? And science, that's where it comes from, right? And the Europeans get that through the Arabs, through Arab translation, right? In the 15th century, when Arab Spain was taken over by the Europeans. That's where okay. Now, in Africa, we haven't been able to reclaim science. So in other words, what we have is, we still, there are, we still the idea that is the Europeans that have, no, we don't have within African societies institutions, that work from the ground up. No, it's just an application of what, as you said, what we get from the West, right? Precisely because our minds are, and so long as we use, for example, right? So long as we use Western textbooks in our school, that's what we use, right? I mean, in other words, in Africa, people come to America. Well, what school did we go to? We went to American school. In other words, and the way in which, under the guise of educational assistance, what one is doing is grooming a whole generation of people that look to the West for what, and we have to stop that, right? And that's why the struggle now becomes much more complex. So it's just a question of education. What kind of education?
I guess that kind of makes me ask, and I read it, 𝑘𝙗𝙤𝙘 𝙧𝙙 𝘾𝙖𝙗𝙤. He says language is a carrier of culture. Mm-hmm. So I guess in our experience that we're living now, how are we able to speak to each other without using the head of somebody else?
I don't know how we do that, because I'm just speaking, something came to mind now. For example, in my country of origin, the War of Liberation, they used to print textbooks. They were not very good textbooks. They fell apart and stuff, right? But the textbooks were printed there, created there, done by people that, in view of the needs, you understand what I'm saying? Now, I don't know, I think they come from abroad. So what I'm saying is, we can't, liberation requires, see, what we have to do is reclaim, again, for those who are interested, there's a philosopher from Cameroon by the name of 𝘼𝙢𝙘 who comes up with this idea of generic human identity. Right? What colonialism has done is damaged our generic human identity. Meaning, what it means to be human is not to just walk on two legs. No, it's the capacity to invent worlds, right? The human being creates worlds, right? We do not anymore. We wait for others to create these worlds. And we sort of plug into those worlds. In other words, we find a spot. No, but how does one create a world?
Let's get a few more. We got about 10 more minutes. How many copies do we have of folks want to pick it up? Take about 10 more minutes. Anybody?
I've been doing it.
I see this. Huh? Okay, good. We got copies in. Thank you. Just let people know. So those streaming, we got 50 copies you get here. In fact, I don't know if you want to sign a few of them. So if we don't sell out tonight, you order from 𝑆𝑎𝑛COFA, you get a signed copy. Probably you don't mind signing a few before we continue. But I want to ask you just in this context again, just sitting here taking notes. When you say you don't know how we do that, Cabral receives a lot of pushback. This is what's fascinating me about Thomas's biography of him. We have his thoughts, we have his speeches. What were some of the things that he faced in his lifetime? Internally, the people there on the ground, some of the politics, in his own country that not only inspired him, helped him struggle to write what we have here, so what does he say? Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. I guess doesn't return to the source. But what in your mind are some of the most difficult things Cabral had to fight internally there in the society as they were trying to literally build a society as they were fighting colonialism?
See, as you speak, he has a section where he talks about entitled Brief Analysis of Social Structure in Guinea, right? And he talks about different, for example, he talks about two ethnic groups, the Fula and the Balante, right? And he talks about the Balante as being a communal society that don't have a hierarchy as opposed to the Fula, who at one time collaborated with the Portuguese, right? And so you have, you have societies, certain structures of societies are amenable to exploitation because they have lords and they have kings and they have, and so those are the difficulties that one can think of, because on the one hand, the Balante, but also there are also, as I'm speaking, something came to mind, there are also religious beliefs that are difficult to get rid of. And for example, it's not here, but somewhere else, talks about the fact that the Balante, when they go to fight, right, they grease themselves. Right? It's some kind of religion, right? And Cabral says, when our Balante fighters go to fight, we don't tell them not to grease themselves. We just tell them to make sure that the trenches are equally fortified, and that through their own experience, they learn. Right? There's a way in which the struggle is precise. It's not only getting rid of the Portuguese, but it's also getting rid of these, residual remains of outdated ideas. You understand? And how does one deal with that? You see, because it's I haven't really thought about it.
No, this is good because actually it raises another question as it relates to gender. When he tells them about the nurses, how he trained all these nurses, but then they have children, so now they no longer. How does he grapple with questions of gender in this? Because of course, women, it's not a question of gender equality; it's a question of community. And like he does even. It wasn't the 𝙭𝙗, which was I'm trying to remember the group where it wasn't kings, it was queens. And it wasn't queens because I'm married to the king. It's like successive queens from queens. But how does he grapple with this question of gender, which is essential to his thought?
I really have to thought about that.
Oh, okay. No, I'm just thinking about it. I'm thinking about it in terms of, you know what? Let me ask you another question in that context. Because you've given us, you teed it up with the 𝙭𝙗 and the cultures. I think a lot of times when we think of return to the source, I've been guilty of this. We think of returning to an Africa that isn't complicated. I'm thinking about many years ago. But Cabral is saying, even as he's grappling with these groups which are maintaining their culture, he's saying, and maybe this goes closer to what you raised, Dr. White. Part of culture is struggle. Is that, I mean, what role does collective struggle play in building that new culture? They're still pulling from the pre-colonial, but also using struggle, maybe Fanon would say violence, as a way to create a new human or a new possibilities, and also maybe diminish or hopefully eliminate those class stratifications that Cabral keeps talking about.
See, we have to think of the idea of inventing. In other words, culture, things come out of need, out of circumstance, situations, right? And there's a way in which, for Cabral, for example, in the introduction I cite Césaire, where he says, you have to be able to be willing to invent, meaning to take risks, to undertake projects that are different, right? And there's a way in which, in this sense, the struggle not only is more complicated, but it's not anymore the expulsion of the foreigner, right? Because there are no foreigners in North Africa, and yet, somewhere I read the people in South Africa saying that things were better when apartheid was around, right? Meaning, we have to be able to even change the struggle. The struggle is not merely against the food, it's also against indigenous Africans, right, that have become westernized. How does one deal with that?
Yes. Oh, go ahead. Yes, thank you. That one I know.
You just mentioned something that was very important when you said in South Africa that something South Africans were saying that it was better when apartheid was there. I just read a recent study and it was talking about South African media. And they say that now they've turned it over to 50% black. But when they studied the media and the things that they were producing and saying, it was the same as it was pre-apartheid. They were saying the same negative type of messages. And the only thing that changed was the color. And it goes back to a point that I keep hearing thread through your conversation. It's like, well, how do we? And again, it starts in education, and they understand that the colonizers understand that, as Steve Biko said, the greatest weapon of the oppressor in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And once they have your mind, and that's what Malcolm, was so clear. It was like, if we can free your mind, if we can change, if we're able to alter your thinking at all, then you might be able to see the possibilities around you of what can be created, and that creativity lies within yourself if your mind isn't completely shut down by the colonizer. And that is, that's universal, and it really doesn't matter where you go.
It's like, just to add to what you say, for example, in the days of the liberation struggle, you would always have the liberated area, right? The liberation struggle is always a way of enlarging the territory that the colonizer controlled, right? And so in that area, right, then you're faced with ad hoc solutions. You have no other option, you understand? So these ad hoc solutions, right, is inventive. That is what inventiveness is, right? You know, when I was a student, when I just finished my PhD, I went to my country, war was going on. And when it goes at night, you know, they have lights. You know? And then I looked around and there were no switches, you understand? So I said to one of the guys, I said, how do you put on the lights? He said, what? Can't you see we have lights? Can't you see where we put the lights? I said, no, I don't. So, but when I looked at the wall, they had syringes, you understand syringe? They had medical department, fighters get wounded, doctor, right? So syringe, you use them, you throw it away, but they didn't throw them away. They get the syringe, they put negative and positive, and so when you push it, the lights come on. You see, but now, see, one would hope that one would develop this, right? No. Now we have switches, right? In other words, now this is just a small example, but that is what we have to get away from. We have to be able to reclaim ourselves, to reclaim our capacity to invent, as opposed to replicate.
Yeah. Turn it on.
Oh, turn it on?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
You see it.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, so I guess you're thinking about Heidegger, you mentioned Heidegger earlier, right? And his actually centralizing, I guess, human reasoning and thinking in this idea of being and non-being, and the ability to produce something out of nothing, in the sense of being able to think that thing sort of kind of into existence, maybe. So would it be fair to say, I guess, in creating this, being innovative and creating this something new can also have the art of, I guess, when you're creating culture, bringing in things that didn't necessarily exist in the way that it did before, and of course from a collective nature, but also understand what you were saying earlier about appropriating things from other cultures. But I guess at some point, when you think about technology, progress, or anything, you are implementing something new or something that may not have existed before. So I guess it shows the ability of the human to reason and to be able to reason together, I guess, to create this newness. Because if you're talking about education in its early forms and how it influences one's mind, at some point when people start to think outside of their cultural boundaries to create this something new, that it is a possibility in and of that with the collective thinking of the human mind, that there is something about the human's ability to reason, even when in challenged situations out of need, as you were saying earlier.
See, if I could add something to what you're saying earlier, when your mind is controlled, right? There's a way in which, for example, in his piece, Discovery of What It Means to Be an American, Baldwin talks about going abroad to France and discovering that he was just as American as any G.I. Joe, and then meeting whites and stuff. And then he says, he left because he did not want to be merely a Negro. And you become merely a Negro when you end up believing what the segregator, he said, white, the segregators say about you, right? So he leaves. Then he discovers there in Europe that he and white Americans are more or less, American. Then it occurs to him that he indeed has ingested a great deal, and he says he has a breakdown. He says, in the white mountains he goes to Switzerland, with the record of Bessie Smith and stuff, and he listens to how he spoke, and he says all those things he was trying to see. This inventiveness presupposes that you've gotten rid of this need to squash yourself. See, once you do that, then you can invent. Until you do that, it's like you're a horse who's I don't know. Your blinker, your control, you understand? Once you get rid of that, then you can engage things. because Hefratibun, there is no shame in it. You understand what I'm saying? And he says, after that, he says, I listened to records of Miss Smith and I could eat watermelon. I could never do that before. He said, and then he said, Bessie Smith, reconciled me to being a nigger, meaning he reclaims himself. So, and in Africa, we haven't done that. In Africa, a westernized African, very rare to find a westernized African that would go into a local pub, for example. Yes. A local pub, not the pub that me and you would go to now. The local pub where the guard, the shoe shine boy. Because it's a completely different world. It's not only it's not clean or anything, it's just a completely different world. What it eats and how it's eaten, what it's drank, it's completely different. So the westernized African then is caught between. See, this is the frustration complex that Cabral is doing. It's caught between. He's not white, but he's not black. He's in between. He has to do something. In this in between, Fanon talks about it as the zone of non-being. Yes. That's what he is. Yes. So he has to overcome that.
Yes. Prof, you got about Peter. You got the last question, and I'm gonna ask a quick question about how you put the book together, and then we'll close out and get some insight. Play about.
I'd just like to say real quick, I'd like to get you all's response. Like I say, the organization that I told you that we don't. In our organization, you cannot be a Muslim Pan-Africanist, a Christian Pan-Africanist, a Nigerian Pan-Africanist. You got to be a Pan-Africanist Muslim, a Pan-Africanist Christian, a Pan-Africanist Nigerian, a Pan-Africanist African American, and of course we get criticized for that. But people who I have good friends, and they said, I'm a Muslim friend. I said, fine, you can't be a part of our organization. Because we want someone who's Pan-Africanist first. Then you're a Muslim. Then you're a Christian. Then you're a Nigerian. Because that's the only way we're going to be able to really combat. Because that's the way the rest of the world see us. The Asians, the Europeans, and the North Americans. They see it, and they want to see divisions. They don't want to see us. And as long as if we start calling ourselves Pan-Africanists, that'll be a much more effective to me. And I have a couple of friends who are very upset with me because, they're one Muslim, one's a Christian. I said, no, you cannot be a part of our group. Because we want you to be a Pan-Africanist Muslim, a Pan-Africanist Christian.
Could you say something maybe about how Cabral approaches that question of ideology? Because there are many even today who would call him a Marxist, but he himself.
No, but Cabral is not a Marxist.
It's about ideology.
Neither is he an anti-reform.
They call him. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. While about Peter, I raised that because he seems to be non-ideological in the sense of he's going to work with whoever he can work with. I don't know, but maybe I'm overstating.
No, Cabral is not ideological in the sense he does not. First off, you were saying earlier he's not militarist. He's not. He thinks of himself as a political militant, a political organization, and we're forced to take up arms against the Portuguese. But there's nothing military about us. One. Secondly, he's neither against Marx, for Marx. He believes certain ideas from Marx, the idea of class struggle, but it has to be specific to Africa. Right? So there's class struggle in Africa. What's the class struggle? Well, the people of Guinea-Bissau are fighting against Portuguese colonialism, Portuguese capital. It's not a question of, it's not a question of universal classes, that feudal. It's not like that. We have to be specific. In other words, his analysis of class struggle, you'll find in that section where he says a brief analysis of it says brief analysis of social structure in Guinea. And his analysis, class struggle is analyzing the different ethnic groups, right? And those who live in the cities, those who live in the countryside, and their situation vis-a-vis the movement, vis-a-vis their stand against the Portuguese or for the Portuguese, right? So that, in other words, that is what's interesting about Cabral, because otherwise, no, I mean, I appreciate and I admire Nkrumah, but his book Class Struggle in Africa, nothing about Africa about it. You know, there's just you know, categories, you know, there's something missing. Whereas here, he's talking about the African situation, right? You know, and the Fula, the Balanta, this, that. And also it's a process, you know, there's a place, I don't remember now where, but he says, 10 years ago, we were Balanta, Fula, Madinga. Today, we are a nation of Guineans, right? And that is sort of, Africa is a process of making itself. And in that sense, okay, Pan-Africanism also has to be taken. In other words, that it is not something that we can choose to do today. You know, rather, it is something, that was, you know, the idea of a united Europe goes back to the 18th century.
He makes that point. He makes that point. Yeah. He says well, it take like 1,000 years for them to come.
Yeah, and they came together, right?
Yeah.
We should do the same. On the other hand, you have the, you know, you have the European Union, and soon thereafter it says the African Union, right? I mean, I find that a bit uninteresting, you know. OAU would have been much better.
Is that example of
Yeah. OAU would have been much better, you know. EU then AU. What then? Unity of Africa, but not for today. You know, we think ahead, right? And we think ahead, you know, and it will come, but it will, you know, at least that's how I see it.
That's just a quick question, and anybody want to get your copies and come on and get them signed. Prof, we know, of course, in the wake of Cabral's assassination, January 1973, later that year, the first edition of this book comes out.
Yes.
Now, in 2023, between the African Information Service, Monthly Review Press, what is different about this volume than that 1973 volume, and what was the process by which you came to even undertake this project?
See, I use Cabral when I teach African philosophy, and I use Cabral when I teach African philosophy, and the first edition, it was fine, it was smaller, and then also I'm sorry to say, and I'm not trying to criticize, there were mistakes. In other words, there were things that were skipped, right? There were not only typos, but huge chunks would be skipped, and so you read something, and then the following thing would be a bit strange, right? And I had a copy of that I xeroxed at the library, a copy of important piece here entitled National Liberation in Culture, right? And I had that, the original, actually, it was in Amherst College, they had the original, and I xeroxed that. Then when I compared them, I found that it was completely. So then I contacted Monthly Review. I emailed them. I said, look, I use this, but that's a problem. We should expand it. I said, hey, why don't you do it? So, yeah,
You got the good work reward.
Yeah.
More work.
I'm happy to do it, and that's how it was done. But yeah, I think it's for anybody who's interested in Africa today, for example, this, along with Fanon's Rachel of the Earth, which is a classic, this also is very, very important.
Well, thank you, Professor Sarah 𝘾𝙗𝙖𝙧. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this conversation with us. And y'all want to get a book signed, you know, get behind me because I'm getting mine signed right now. So let's give them a round of applause and thank you. Thank you. Okay, let them know if they want to get it.
Oh, believe that. I got you. I'm
Okay, cool.
no problem. Thank you again for that real. Check. All right. Thank you all so much for rocking with the best. This is Sankofa Video Books Cafe, where we just had an incredible talk. I hope that energized you and encouraged you to live your life to the fullest. and spread that light to everybody you come into contact with, so you can elevate the quality of life all around. I want to remind y'all, we are located at 2714 Georgia Avenue Northwest, where you can come in, you know what I mean, catch a vibe, and also get this book physically in your hand. If you're not here, you know what I'm saying, not in DC, not in the area, never fear, Sankofa is here. You just go on www.sankofa.com, and if you want to get this title from my good man right here, that would be much appreciated. You already know. This is another installment of Scholar Hour here at Sankofa Video Books Cafe. My name is 𝘼𝙢𝙤 if you're curious. And much love from me and mine to you and yours.
What's going on, Dr. Carr?